Hello, and welcome back to the Let's Talk Universal podcast, where one of our key discussion topics is neurodiversity in the workplace. And joining me today to talk about that very thing is founder of Welcome Brain Consulting, Andy Williamson. Welcome, Andy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute joy to have you. Now, we met a while back and we had a great conversation about the work that you're doing at Welcome Brain, and you very graciously contributed to the UWI magazine that's come out in the end of September. So thank you for that. But for our audience, I wondered if you'd like to kind of introduce yourselves to them and tell us how you got into this topic of workplace neuroinclusion.
Yeah, well, so I'm Andy. As you said, I run Welcome Brain Consulting, and I came to I've been working in neurodiversity for about 15 years now, and I came to it through education. So I ran an education business that worked with students who had kind of additional support needs, people that we sort of class as neurodivergent now. And I was just really interested in the way that one-to-one tutoring often solved a lot of the problems that students who struggled in classroom environments faced. Um, I mean, just if you can tailor the educational experience to the student's actual brain, then they have really good outcomes. And as an offshoot of the education business I was running, I also ran a mental health private practice. These were both based in America, in Seattle, when I was based over there. And after sort of selling the mental health private practice, I thought about, well, what comes next? And I said, well, I've worked with young people who have those additional support needs and sort of young adults who do, but there's nothing in the world of work that corresponds to the work we've been doing with education. So you see a lot of people, young people who have, say, for example, extra time in exams, they get the adjustments when they're at school or at university, and then people go into the world of work and there's really nothing for them like that. So it seemed to me that there was a big sort of gap and a big void that we as a society need to address, and that personally we can address through working through Welcome Brain, and that was what led me to start it up. Yeah.
Amazing stuff. And I think, it's not an uncommon story that I've heard on the podcast and events that we've done, in the sense that, there's this drop off, this kind of drop of support when you enter kind of adulthood and into the workplace. And as you say, harking back to those education days, I worked in a school for a year, and I remember there was a session on differentiation of lessons. How do you differentiate what you're teaching in a way that means that you capture all the different learning types and the different levels of students in a pretty mixed class of teenagers, and it had occurred to me that why don't we do this in the workplace? Why is it that we can't apply that here as well?
Oh, well, that's exactly the idea of differentiation. I mean, the central premise of Welcome Brain and the thematic connection that's existed between all of the businesses I've just mentioned that I ran are that we shouldn't make individuals conform to institutions. We have the capacity now to allow institutions to shape to fit the individuals that are in them and differentiate and personalize their experience. That's the sort of the basic idea. It's a very simple premise, and I think, like you said, we do understand it now. It's necessary in education, but I think the world of work is lagging a little bit behind that idea.
Yeah. And with Welcome Brain, obviously, we've talked about how it started, but what is it, how is it serving businesses now? What problem is it helping to solve?
Well, so when I'm talking to business owners, I always say there's three reasons why you should be neuroinclusive. The first one is that it's ethical, it's the right thing to do. There's sort of a social justice element to it, that it's a form of inclusion and therefore we should be doing it. The second one is that it's the law, that actually you have to do it. That's the carrot and the stick argument. But the final one, and the one I think is most powerful, and the one that we probably talk about the least and should maybe talk about a little bit more, is that it's actually a profit-driven decision. So if you run a neuroinclusive business, your employees are more productive, they're happier, you retain employees better, and it impacts bottom line. So this is, with neuroinclusion for businesses, this is not something that is sacrificial, and this is not something that you need to see as costing you money, because it's an investment in the short term, but it definitely reaps rewards and boosts profit in the long term. Absolutely, no doubt about that.
Yeah, because you often think about, a business building its 5-year, 10-year plan, they're looking that far ahead. And you're basically saying, by investing, this amount right now into neuroinclusion, it forms a part of that 5-year, 10-year plan, that for if you look at Richard Branson and was it Virgin
Hmm.
Flights, that he knew that he wouldn't make a return on that for at least 3 or 4, 5 years, but he still invested in it because he saw the potential, the ROI of that for the wider Virgin brands. And so really that's what we're saying. We're saying that it's a much longer investment with returns, at some point.
Yeah, I mean that's sometimes a hard sell. Is you invest in this and you might see returns in 4 or 5 years. But I think there's also sort of the bigger point that 20% of the population is neurodivergent, and if you're not running your business for 1 in 5 people, either as customers or as employees, then you're not running your business efficiently. And so if you're struggling with things like recruitment and retention, and you're not neuro-inclusive, then that's a very simple fix to what is a really fundamental business problem. And so I think you probably do see returns on that quite quickly. The extent to which you can prove that your employees are retained and therefore that's saving you money is sometimes harder to prove. But you can definitely see sort of benefits immediately once you start on the neuro-inclusion journey. It's very quick. And not all of the neuro-inclusion changes you need to make actually cost a lot of money or are super time intensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is often a surprise for a lot of business owners because they think you come in and you're going to tell us to make all these expensive changes, but a lot of what we do actually you can do for free.
Yeah, and I guess there's the other aspect of this where it's not just, aimed at recruiting and retaining neurodivergent people. It's actually, by catering to, I don't know, a niche group, that require more support or, more flexibility. But actually, you benefit everybody by doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that 100%, and that's the thing that you notice, and the statistic that 20% of the population are neurodivergent implies that 80% of people are neurotypical. And when you say it like that, that doesn't sound super plausible. So I would say it sort of works more like a distribution where 20% of people are neurodivergent, 20% of people are probably neurotypical, and then there's this 60% group in the middle. Call them sort of the neurocurious people, and those are the people who benefit most actually from a lot of these neuro-inclusive policies. Things like work from home or just a quieter office environment or a different office environment, allowing them to personalize their experience a little bit more. That's where you see productivity across the board. But even those 20% of people who would class as neurotypical will see benefits from a more personalized, more autonomous experience in the work environment. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess on the kind of the business case of neurodiversity, is there anything else that organizations or organizational leaders should really know about the impact of neuroinclusion on their business?
There's a lot of data. There's a lot of sort of gobbets of data around how you can be a better run business if you're neuro-inclusive. There's not yet the big sort of longitudinal study that demonstrates it, but I mean, the sort of headline statistic I always use is that NASA deliberately recruits neurodivergent employees, and NASA as an organization has more than 50% of its employees are neurodivergent. So whatever your business, however important you think it is not more important than putting somebody on the moon and getting them back. So if NASA thinks these people are worth hiring, they're a giant pool of talent, then you can absolutely afford to do that in your business. And I mean, there is also sort of smaller, less sort of macro statistics, things like neurodiverse organizations make decisions faster. If you have a meeting and you include neurodiverse voices in there, if you have a true sort of neurodiversity of thought within a meeting, you make decisions about 30% faster. And then employee retention is much better if you have a neuro-inclusive business. So yeah, there are a lot of statistics pertaining to kind of the business case, the capitalist case for being neuro-inclusive.
Yeah, yeah. And if we just kind of look at the current state of neuro-inclusion, I guess, because obviously your work has been, 15 years of talking about neuro-inclusion in education and, through into workplace. But I guess in the workplace, it's still a relatively new, shall I say, topic, in the sense that I think the conversations I've had with organizations are still at that education space,
Yep.
awareness space of trying to understand what it is, and why it's important. But why do you think we're seeing now this change, with organizations prioritizing neurodiversity? Is it because they just have been told that they need to?
Yeah, cynically, there probably is an element of that involved. I would say so, and I think that that's, so with our certification scheme, we're trying to create that market pressure so that businesses actually sort of do have to think about it. I think if you look at the three sort of segments of society, if you look at society as a whole, you look at the business world, and you look at politics, society is far ahead in terms of neuro-inclusion. So you're more likely to chat about neuro-inclusion amongst your friends in the pub or at a coffee shop or something like that, and be more understanding. The world of sort of the corporate world is behind that, and when you go into businesses, there's still quite a lot of pushback you get, particularly from managers, about what this actually involves. And then I think that the third point of that is the politics, is the legislation. The Equality Act is pretty outdated now, and I think that it's sort of it's a something that needs to improve simultaneously. We need to improve workplace culture, but then we also need the legislation to drive that, I think. So I think that that's why that society is a little bit ahead. I think that sort of when you look at the generational element to it, I think that millennials are very, I would describe myself as a millennial, are very good at self-diagnosing and talking about elements of neurodivergence. I think Gen Z are much more expecting of adjustments, which is a great thing. And I think that as those generations age into the senior positions within a corporation, there's definitely going to be big changes coming.
And I think, you've pinpointed something, which is that the generation coming into the workforce is expectant of certain things, a great, workplace culture where well-being is prioritized and there's flexibility. And, for organizations who aren't willing to cede a little bit of that power to the talent that they're bringing into their organization, as you say, the attraction of talent into their organization is going to be pretty poor.
Yeah, and at the moment, I think now if you can demonstrate that you're neuro-inclusive, you are showing a competitive advantage. But increasingly, it's going to shift to the extent that you can't afford not to be neuro-inclusive, as the majority of the workforce becomes Gen Z or millennial and more expecting of these things. I mean, we see it happening now with work from home, and companies are still struggling with that, sort of demanding people come back to the office. And any business that offers flexible working or virtual working just receives X number of applications for the job compared with a company that doesn't offer that. So the free market is sort of making its voice heard, and employees are demanding more of employers now, and I think neuro-inclusion is going to be a big part of that.
Yeah, and just kind of harking back to that legislation piece, are you seeing changes? Because remind me, when we last spoke, I feel like we spoke about some changes that were happening. Was it in Scotland?
Yeah. So I'm based in Scotland. I'm in Edinburgh, and so the key legislation is still the Equality Act, UK-wide Equality Act, but there is a bill that's working its way through the Scottish Parliament, which is called LDAN. It's the Learning Disability Autism Neurodiversity Bill, and it remains to be seen. It's still at an early stage. It's probably about 18 months or so out from becoming actual legislation. But what that will effectively do is be more explicit about the provisions that are in the Equality Act about neurodiversity. So it will enshrine sort of neuro-inclusion in workers' rights. The difficulty with that is that workers' rights is a policy of Westminster, not of Holyrood. So what that effectively means is that will apply to public sector work in Scotland, and any company that wants to work with the public sector. But probably what we'll see as a result of this legislation is it'll have a normative effect. So even private businesses will sort of conform to the stipulations of it. And it's likely that this will serve as a template for what happens in the wider UK and in private sectors as well. So this is sort of like the vanguard of updated legislation, but a lot more will follow, probably based on this model, I'd imagine.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I wonder whether we'll see similar shifts in other geographies as well, like in the US and Canada, because I guess, even with things like ESG, it's been a bit of a delayed uptake in places like the US, whereas in the EU it's much more established. So I imagine
Yeah.
that's probably the same.
Oh, well, and they have legislation that we don't have. So in the EU now, they have the European Accessibility Act, which is very similar to the US. They had the IDEA Act, and Canada had introduced one in 2019, which states that the websites and companies' media has to be accessible. We don't really have legislation that relates to that. So if you have any hardware or software, mobile apps, any interface you use, like, point of sale when you're buying in a shop, all of those have to be accessible in the EU from June of next year, and the US has that currently. So the UK doesn't have that type of legislation yet, but it's likely that sort of this represents a wider shift towards more neuro-inclusive legislation. It's likely that something like that will come soon to the UK, and I think probably there'll be an update to the Equality Act at some point.
Yeah.
The Labour government have talked about it, and they talked about it when they were campaigning, and they want to update workers' rights in general. And I think that when they do update it, there'll sort of be a clear out of some of the outdated elements from the 2010 Act.
Yeah. And do you think then that puts a bit more pressure on businesses to make these changes, making it a compliance regulatory issue, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it will make it that they have to do it. So
Yeah.
like the ultimate pressure, really, isn't it? Is you have to do it, or you'll get fined or get put in prison. So what other motivators are there? So yeah, I think that will be huge. I mean, what we've seen really, because the Equality Act, only sort of implicitly protects a lot of neurodivergent traits, is that a lot of the legislating is being done by case laws and by tribunals and the precedents set there. So it's quite messy, really, and there's a lot of grey areas. And I don't think really anybody benefits from the legislation happening in this way. So it would be good to see a proper updating of it. I mean, 2010 was such a long time ago that we didn't have the same understanding of neurodiversity as we do now. So it makes sense that the legislation just needs a bit of a modernization, really.
Yeah. No, I completely understand that. And I do just want to go back to Welcome Brain for a second, because we could talk about neurodiversity and kind of the legislation and what it all means, what are the benefits forever, I'm sure. But for Welcome Brain, exactly what services are you offering people? Because we've kind of mentioned this certification, but what else is Welcome Brain helping organizations with?
I mean, it's a whole range of services. So it's anything that relates to neuroinclusion or neurodiversity, or neurodivergent employees. So the most sort of straightforward thing we offer is workshops and training. So at the moment we're working to get our accreditation for CPD hours. So when you do a workshop or training with us, you can sort of count them as CPD hours. We work with businesses on HR guides and policy documents, getting those legal structures in place and just having the protocols and procedures in place. We do employee coaching if organizations have a specific employee that just needs a bit of support. Sometimes even offering that support, saying, if anybody does need help, we work with Welcome Brain and they can get coaching through that. That's really helpful for employees. And then, as we've mentioned, we do a certification scheme. So that follows on from an audit. So we do a big audit business. That's the sort of the big granular detail where we go right in and really help organizations from the ground up to become neuro-inclusive. And then as a part of that, as an outcome of that, we can certify them as being neuro-inclusive. So they get the ability to demonstrate that they are neuro-inclusive.
Yeah, and what is kind of the overall ambition with this certification? What's the desired outcome from all of that work?
Well, I think I mentioned it before. It's a little bit to create a market pressure on organizations to be neuro-inclusive. I mean, it's similar, I suppose, to a B Corp status or getting certified through living wage or something like that. It helps you by putting structures in place and sort of a checklist approach that you can actually sort of do it, rather than just say we want to be neuro-inclusive, we don't know how to do it. We have a very sort of detailed guide on how you actually do it, and so we want to help organizations who are looking for help to sort of become neuro-inclusive, go through that journey. It can be very daunting and it can seem very fractal, that it never ends. The more detail you go into, the more detail there is. But we help them, and in the vast majority of cases, you can solve 80% of problems with 20% of the work, and then it's just how much detail you want to go into. But when organizations do become neuro-inclusive, it helps them attract more customers, it helps them attract more employees, and it helps them sort of manage and maintain their team. that they already have. So the goal is to sort of create an environment where neuroinclusion is taken as standard. That's ambitious maybe, but that's what we're working towards.
Yeah. And so is it kind of a certification of, I guess, a commitment to neuro-inclusive practices? Even like, is it a positive thing that an organization is, going through this audit and going through this certification, even if their current state is quite poor?
Yes, yeah. I think to be honest, the most important stage to make on the sort of neuroinclusion journey is to admit that you want to go on the journey, right? I think that's the most positive step. And when we speak to organizations, they say, "Oh, we haven't really done anything on this so far. This is new to us." Um, Say, well, that doesn't matter. The fact that you've made this call is huge, and your employees will already sort of be more mindful and respectful of the organization because you've started this journey. So there's no situation where we say, oh, you're beyond help or you're fundamentally incapable of neuroinclusion. We'd never do that. So yeah, I mean, there's no state really that an organization could be in that where they're beyond help, and yeah, like I said, most of the big changes you can make are very straightforward, very simple things you can do very quickly. So
Yeah.
yeah, it can turn around very fast.
And what does the journey look like then? So if someone's listening and they're like, "Oh, that sounds interesting," what's the journey that an organization would go on? And also, do they have to have any kind of requirements that they have to meet before they go on this journey with you? What does that look like?
No, I mean, there's no requirements in advance of starting the audit process, and the first step is that we would usually meet with the organization and just get as much information as possible, where they are, where they're at, what's their history, and just find out as much about the organization, because any audit or certification has to be tailored towards the organization itself. It's not something that we do blanket. It's very much personalized. It sort of befits our overall theme, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so we would meet with the key individuals and sort of at the very beginning and chat through with them what the process looks like. But in general, what we do is we do employee surveys and interviews with employees to get a sense of how they perceive things. A survey with the leaders and management, or who are the key decision makers, and we interview them as well. And then we audit the key parts of the business as we see it. So, what do your policy documents look like? Do you have any sort of stated policy on neuroinclusion at present? What is your recruitment like? Recruitment is a huge area where you can see improvement very quickly. So, what does the language of your job posting look like? What's your interview process? What does onboarding look like? Those can be really terrible times for neurodivergent people. What sort of management tools are you using? Work from home, flexible working, grievance policies do you have? What adjustments do you put in place? Reasonable adjustments do you put in place? Because sometimes they may actually be in breach of the law, and you can again address that quite quickly. What does your physical office space look like? What's the environment you work in? That's obviously sort of something that a lot of neurodivergent people struggle with, the actual office environment itself. And then we look at some of the data involved in the business. Do they keep data on how many people disclose that they are neurodivergent? Do they keep any data on how many neurodivergent people they have in general? And then based on a series of benchmarks, we would then certify them, and it gets re-inspected after 3 years. So that's a way to make sure that there is some accountability. This is not just a tick box exercise. If we are going to certify you as neuro-inclusive, then you have to sort of abide by these principles and make sure you actually make those changes. So sometimes we would certify business not on where they're at the moment, but where they say they're going to go. And so it's often easier to get certified in the first place than it is to stay certified, because you actually have to do the things that we've talked about.
Yeah.
But yeah, as I say, it's tailored towards specific organizations. It's not intended to be super onerous. I mean, I know the B Corp process can take years to complete and can be really tricky. Ours isn't intended to be like that. And it's understood that we're helping businesses. There's not sort of a punitive element to it where we're punishing businesses for previous non-neuro-inclusive crimes. It's very much understood that we're all sort of working together on this process, and we're not there to cancel anybody or get anybody in trouble. So
Yeah. No, it sounds great. And what I really like, as someone coming from, marketing and consulting, is this, this approach of, right, let's get it understood kind of where your business is at, what are your goals, and like aligning it with the organization, because as you kind of mentioned, NASA is known for innovation. So really you're looking to build an innovating culture within your business, whereas, you know, for other organizations it's customer service is like our number one priority. So, you know, it's about aligning to the business, because you don't just want to be recruiting talent for the sake of recruiting talent. Like, you want them to fit in your culture, right?
Exactly. And you know, there's two parts to every business, isn't there? There's the structures of it and the culture that underpins that. And it's a lot easier to change the structures than it is to change the culture. The culture can be a bit trickier. So you have to, that's where you're right, have to tailor it towards their specific culture and what the business's goals are and where they've been. You know, what's the existing team like? I spoke with someone at Microsoft. They've done a lot of sort of pioneering work on this and on hiring neurodivergent employees. And they said that the biggest challenge they faced in sort of becoming neuro-inclusive in those specific teams that were doing it was educating the neurotypical people on what is neurodiversity. Is it unfair that these people are being allowed these adjustments that not everybody gets? So that is often one of the biggest challenges for a business. So you can't just sort of storm into a business and say, right, you're all terrible people because you're not neuro-inclusive. We're perfect people. We're holier than thou, and this is what you need to do. And if you oppose it, then we're going to cancel you. You have to work within an organization. It's very much a collaborative process, and you have to work in partnership with the organization, because, I mean, ultimately, if our thesis is that a neuro-inclusive business is better for everyone, you have to show that at all stages of the process of them becoming neuro-inclusive, that this is something that is going to benefit everybody. You know, everybody in the organization, employees, employers, senior management, middle management, everybody.
Yeah.
And we have to actually practice that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's sometimes you do get that resistance from people who already exist in your organization. So it's something that I don't think we talk about a lot, actually, when we talk about any kind of, you know, incorporating an underrepresented group in an organization. Is, you know, there's this, we don't talk about the existing population. We talk about the people we're trying to bring in, but, you know, there's, as you said, there's that challenge of bringing everyone in your organization on the journey as well.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that it is very clear that some of the changes that we make do benefit everybody. I mean, you don't have to be neurodivergent to think that work from home is a good thing and to enjoy working from home, right? That's
Yeah.
fairly accepted now, and it took a pandemic for everybody to be forced to understand that. But these are the sorts of things. Shouldn't be an element of jealousy or envy about some people being allowed certain privileges that other people aren't allowed. Because if you create a truly neuro-inclusive organization, you should be looking at a post-disclosure organization, whereby it doesn't matter if somebody discloses that they are neurodivergent, because all of the things that neurodivergent people are able to access are available to everybody. So it's a sort of, it's a post disclosure, a post sort of adjustments world where everybody adjusts their own experience, and that's what a good organization does when they become neuro-inclusive.
Yeah. Well, inclusive, as you say. You know.
Exactly. I mean, like, neurodiversity is different from other forms of diversity because it is an invisible diversity. And so I always say this. I said that sort of neurodivergent people, they already walk amongst us. So in every organization, this is why I talk about neuroinclusion, not necessarily neurodiversity, because organizations are currently neurodiverse. They just don't necessarily know it.
Yeah.
So this is where you do get some element of resentment potentially building up as people suddenly out themselves as neurodivergent. And people say, well, you're just doing that so you can access XYZ adjustment. Not necessarily understanding that these people have been living without the needed adjustments for years. So there is the potential for that. And so, yeah, you do have to be delicate in managing it. But again, once you create your neuro-inclusive environment, everybody does benefit. And you have to keep reminding people of that.
Yeah. And with the certification then, and this audit, and I guess kind of all of the services that you're providing an organization, how is that then helping them to build a sustainable kind of initiative that, you know, isn't just like, oh, we're going to do it all in one go, or, oh no, we can't sustain this in the long term? Like, how does it help them to build that more sustainable long-term strategy?
Yeah, well, the good thing about sort of even beginning the journey is that it becomes a virtuous circle quite quickly. So what you find is that if management decisions include neurodiverse voices, then they don't create policies that exclude neurodivergent people. So as an example of that, if you look at organizations, they might introduce a headphone ban in the office. They might say, look, everybody's in the office. We don't like that they're listening to headphones. Maybe it's a safety issue with a fire alarm or something like that, or we just don't like it. And the management get together and they say, okay, we're going to ban headphones in the office. For someone who's neurodivergent, maybe has ADHD or is autistic, the headphones are actually what allows them to do their job. Nobody who was, who had ADHD or who was autistic on that management board would make that decision. That's a policy that wouldn't happen. So if you allow neurodivergent people to get promoted and to become more senior and to include them in decision-making processes, it means your organization makes more neuro-inclusive decisions. And let's not forget people we've not really talked about in this so far, which is the customers of an organization. So
Yes.
again, if an organization is neuro-inclusive, they're going to make decisions that benefit neurodivergent clients or neurodivergent potential clients. And again, this is 20% of the population. So you can't really afford to ignore that segment of the population. So yeah, in the same way, if you talk about, I don't know, including women on boards or having racial diversity on a board, it benefits the organization the whole way down. You can't just have neurotypical people making decisions for neurodivergent people. So there is a real sustaining element to it. Once you begin this journey, it permeates throughout the organization as a whole. And this is something that we do have to remind businesses of, is that neuro-inclusion can't just be the purview of your HR department. This can't be something that there's sort of the minister for neuro-inclusion within your organization. This is something that has to permeate throughout the organization as a whole. And once you start doing that, you'll start making different decisions and better decisions and more inclusive decisions.
Yeah, and so you've kind of hit on something that I wanted to ask you, which was, like, I guess you've got who is responsible for this, but then who ends up with the task of actually doing something about it? Like, who would you say are those two kind of people? Are they the same, or are they, I imagine they're probably two different people within an organization?
Yeah, I mean, the first point of contact and where this always begins is with the HR department. You always start there, and it's usually driven by the HR department. But so they're usually sort of the genesis of this, and they're tasked with it. But really, what determines the success is the buy-in from the leadership. It's not something that can just be a pet project of HR and everybody sort of humors them and goes along with it. You need the buy-in from senior leadership and from managers, because those are the people who are really doing it. I mean, your question was, who's responsible for this? And we would never say that about gender equality. So who's responsible for gender equality in the workplace? Is that just HR? This is something that you need to bake into the structure of your business, and it needs to be company-wide policies. And that's really true. So yeah, it does begin with the HR department, but this has to be everybody's responsibility. There's nobody within an organization should say, well, I don't have to care about gender equality. And so we would say the same thing about neurodiversity. There should be nobody who can say that within an organization.
Yeah, no, it's funny, isn't it? Because a lot of the time when we talk about, we asked one of our guests on an event recently, who's responsible for culture, and his response was, well, isn't the CEO responsible for culture? Because again, it's just aligning with the business. What does it do? Who does it serve? How does it serve them? And building that culture that aligns with that purpose. So it's I like to ask who's responsible, because sometimes it's like, well, actually kind of everyone's responsible. So
yep. yeah well, I agree that the CEO and the senior leadership are the ones that are in charge of sort of setting the culture. But actually, sort of on a day-to-day basis, the de facto culture is bottom up. It's driven by everybody in the organization. And so those are the right answers, right? It's everybody and also the CEO.
Yeah. So if I just kind of go back to, I think we may have mentioned this, Andy, but I do want to kind of make sure that this is a takeaway for people, is what are the key elements that you would say, or kind of from experience, would say that kind of is a truly neuro-inclusive organisation? I feel like we've touched on this, but I think it would be great just to like state it.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I mentioned it before, sort of post-disclosure organization. That's always a big test. I've heard of an organization that was at a conference last week, and they were talking about how people don't need to ask for, to hold meetings just walking around the office. They actually have a swing in their office, and there's no requirement to sort of ask to use it. It's just sort of it's understood that everybody has their unique way of working. So ultimately, I mean, that is the evidence, is when people are viewed truly as individuals. So I always use this analogy, but there's an amazing section of an amazing book, and the book's called The End of Average by a guy called Todd Rose, and he talks about the US Air Force in the aftermath of, or during the Cold War, in the aftermath of the invention of the jet engine. And they were crashing a lot of planes because the additional speed that jet power brought led to pilots not being able to find the right instruments in the cockpit in time. So the US Air Force said, right, well, we need to redesign the cockpits. This is clear. So they said, we'll do this properly. We'll do this scientifically. So they did the biggest data study ever collected at that point, and they measured every pilot in the US Air Force based on how long their arms were, how long their legs were, how long their torso was. And they took the average of all of those numbers and built the cockpits based on those specifications. And when they tested these new cockpits, they found out that it didn't diminish the number of crashes. And they said, well, that doesn't seem to make sense. And they went back and compared the data with the cockpits that they'd built. And they found out that what they built is a cockpit where everybody was equally uncomfortable. So what you find is that people who have average length of arms do not have average length of legs. And across all these different metrics, there was no single pilot who fitted every single average. So they just created sort of these equally uncomfortable cockpits. And instead they said, well, we've got to come up with a new solution. And the solution they came up with was to invent adjustable seats. So every time a pilot got into the cockpit, they could adjust their seat, move the instruments to fit close to them, and everybody could have that experience that was exactly what they needed. And that's exactly the metaphor for what you need to do in your organization. Many organizations think about inclusion and diversity like that average cockpit where everybody's equally uncomfortable. But instead, you need to build the adjustable seat cockpit. And that's what your organization should do. It should allow people, at the end of your neuroinclusion journey, you should allow people to totally tailor their experience of work. And if you just focus on employees' outcomes, what the work that they produce is, it doesn't really matter how they get there. Allow them to personalize their experience. And that's really what neuroinclusion is. And that's actually what all forms of inclusion are when you boil it down, is allowing that tailored, personalized experience, that adjustable seat business.
I mean, that's such a great analogy. I don't think
I overuse it so much, so you may have heard it already.
No, I don't think I have actually. But yeah, it's as you say, like it's great analogy for not just neuroinclusion, but all forms of inclusion. Like that's the goal, right? So
Yeah.
that it's great. It works really well. And when it comes to this certification, again, just finalizing the point on this, do you think there's a broader, wider impact of this certification, perhaps, more socially in society overall, do you think?
Yeah, I think, going back to those sort of Gen Z and millennial people that we were talking about before, I think they're a lot more discerning. I think that, these schemes like Living Wage or B Corp, I think that there are a lot more customers who are shopping ethically and they look out for things like that. Once you start to look out for these certifications, you see them everywhere. Every coffee shop you go into has the Living Wage logo on it. So I think that there is a societal shift. People are wanting to spend their money in more ethical ways. People are more comfortable withholding money where they perceive it to be unethical. So I think that as a society, we are definitely moving that way. And I think that that's one of the big benefits of our certification, actually. It's not necessarily always about how your internal team functions, but in terms of how your organization interacts with the wider society, with your potential customers. And as I say to organizations, all of this legislation that we've talked about is coming, in terms of you are going to have to do this neuroinclusion at some point. At the moment, it's a competitive advantage, but soon enough, you're going to be losing out. And rather than people actively spending money with you because you are ethical, people are not going to be spending money with you because you're not ethical. So this is a sort of a societal shift that is happening, and you can choose where you want to be in this shift. You can be ahead of the curve or you can be behind the curve, but the curve is coming, so you choose.
Great stuff, great stuff. And as I said, we spoke about kind of the who's responsible, and oftentimes it begins with the HR team. So for an HR leader who is perhaps bogged down with other responsibilities, because they're given a lot, how if they've been given neuroinclusion as an additional task on their task list of this is something that we need to fix, what would your advice be to them in terms of first steps?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, and the good news is for HR professionals is that there are helpful consultancies out there that can do a lot of the work for them and can help in this process. And I think that there is probably an element of diversity fatigue in organizations as well. It can be difficult to say, well, why should we prioritize this versus another type of diversity? But there are definitely, as I mentioned before, there's definitely steps you can take which are really easy to start with and have really sort of tangible benefits very quickly. So hiring and recruitment is the easiest one. And we did a series of posts on LinkedIn for Neurodiversity Celebration Week. And it was, these are the things you can do for free that don't take any time that will make your business more neuro-inclusive. And one of the simplest ones is look at the language of your job posting. So whenever you post a job, whether you post it on a job posting site or advertise it wherever, look at the language you've used. One of the things that companies always do is they just use sort of filler language, which is quite exclusive. So they would say, like, we're a dynamic and ever-changing company. We're a fast-paced and ever-changing startup, something like that. It's just filler language, doesn't even really mean anything.
Yeah.
But someone who is autistic doesn't always want to work in an ever-changing organization. Someone who is neurodivergent might prefer something that is never changing and very regular and predictable and consistent. And what you've done then with that language is just alienate them straight off the bat. So, I mean, that's the interview process, the recruitment process is one of the main reasons why 70% of autistic people in the UK are unemployed versus 14% of the population as a whole. And so if you change the language of your job postings, straight away you'll start to see benefits. And think how often your interview process is based on soft skills. Like, this person made good eye contact and they shook hands and they were kind of charismatic, so we're going to hire that person. Whereas actually that's not really what they have to do in their job. So these are the things that you can change really quickly, really easily. So the idea of this being a big insurmountable problem is not the case. It does look like it is a big insurmountable problem, but there are lots of ways you can make these really, really quick changes that will have really big knock-on effects for your organization.
Great stuff. Well, Andy, thank you so much for today. For anyone who would be interested in learning more about Welcome Brain and its services, where do they go?
So welcomebrain.com is where you can start. We have a form on there. You can get in touch. You can find us on LinkedIn. We post a lot of information about neuroinclusion legislation, things like that. Or you can always email me. That's andy@welcomebrain.com. I'm always interested to hear from people, and I can answer any questions that you might have.
Great stuff. And I'll make sure to pop all of that in the podcast description for you. But Andy, it's been brilliant chatting with you. And I'm sure, we could carry on talking about this in so much more detail, but I guess there's some really significant takeaways from our conversation today for me, which is the moving tide of not only social priorities but also with the legislation. We're beginning to see more specific legislation around neurodiversity and equality that is driving a lot of businesses to start thinking about these things.
Yep.
I guess this concept of inclusion is just providing it's that analogy that you gave us is providing those adjustments where people can adjust work and I guess integrate work into their life in a way that isn't uncomfortable for them and uncomfortable for the organization as well. I think it works both ways. So thank you so much for today. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. And yeah, we'll definitely speak soon. There's a lot more to say.
Absolutely.